All right, let's finish up chapter 12. One thing I didn't mention in the third, or the Italy part of Romanesque Europe, is very important, and that is the reawakening of sculpture in the round. We haven't seen much of that at all. So, all the way to the beginnings of late antiquity, really, whenever they did the sculptures of Christ as Good Shepherd and seated, because they were trying to convert, of course, Romans into becoming Christians. So they did sculptures that were very Greek Roman in regards to the biblical narratives of Jesus, and we really haven't seen that um, up until now. And where we're going to see it is figure 1232, and it's King David, and the artist is Antelomi. And this is going to be really important because we're going to be moving in the next 100 years, let's around late 1300s into early 1400s, is the beginnings of what's called the Renaissance, which is going to be the full reawakening and rebirth of antiquity coming back from the Greek Roman styles of artwork. And this is going to be one of the major precursors to bring back this sense of antiquity that we'll find in the Renaissance, which is heavily covered in Art 142, Art History 142, which is an online course as well that I'll be offering in the winter for 4 weeks. But this sculpture in the round of King David is really important because, again, it's a reawakening of the stone carving in the round. Okay, so it's just been absent for so long, just like the use of concrete was absent for so long. So this is a Romanesque technique of bringing back sculpture in the round, and you can see that there's some distortion and shifting in the body because they're trying to move away from this very flat frontal representational depiction of an individual and trying to give it more of that. Remember, we talked about contrapposto and twisted and shifts in the body that we saw. That is going to find its way back in very slowly. Um, but a little bit that's different in regards to this is the confinement within this niche. And again, learning proportions. If you look at his arms, King David, it looks like they're kind of tucked up against his body because they're trying to figure out space and depth again and levels of dimensionality. So it looks like he's kind of compressed like a sardine in a can inside of this niche. But they're working it out and they're figuring it out, and that's really part of this. That's a big component of this Romanesque period, is they're starting to try to refigure out what has been missing for over 1,000 years during the Middle Ages, during the medieval times. So they're slowly coming out of this and moving into this sense of appreciation to antiquity. Um, you can see that there's no weight shifted on his hips like you would see with the old Greek and Roman sculptures, the Roman sculptures in particular. Um, but the patterns and the head not frontal and the organic drapery is very much Romanesque styles. So the head to the side, that use of the drapery with the toga in particular, and then the head not being frontal, are in the use of patterns as well, like within the pleating of the wardrobe in which King David has on, and the use of the veristic clustering on the beard of his face is very Roman. It's very Romanesque. So we're seeing we're seeing a slight dichotomy in moving away from the flat frontal representational of the Christian artwork that we've seen up to this point, and still the same Orthodox Christian themes, but they're starting to try to develop more elements of humanism, is what it will ultimately be called, and this element of kind of natural animated movement, which the Romans were very good at. But they still want to tell a story and history at the same time. That's why you see the use of the scroll that's coming down across the middle part of his body. Again, the Romans were very big on documenting and recording and writing. So again, that's a Romanesque element as well. Okay, so that concludes the use of the Italian importance of this Romanesque period. And the next thing we're going to take a look at is hold on, figure 1236, and we're going to move into the Normandy and kind of England area. And remember, most of this up here to the far north of Europe were converts, Viking converts into Christianity. And what this area in particular is going to do up in the England and Normandy areas from 1000 to 1200 CE is it's going to set the stage for the future of the French Gothic period, which is going to be the next chapter into the Gothic period. And again, these titles like Gothic were not developed during the time in which we're looking at them. They were the terminology came later to give a description on the historical time. And I'll talk about why it's called Gothic in the next chapter, but what we're going to see right here in figure 1236 and figure 1237 and then anything following these is going to be the precursors to the Gothic period. Gothic, G-O-T-H-I-C, and in particular the French Gothic period. So the Durham Cathedral is what we're looking at. And the Durham Cathedral, just a quick little background, it's going to be where the Normans or the descendants of the Vikings, which are now converted into Christianity, are going to take over England. And it's going to completely transform the style of what's going on in England at that time. They're going to use the use of that groin vaulted ceiling over the nave. And then the vaults are going to start to line up visually with the arcades below. Right? So if you look at figure 1236, rib vaulting is where you have thick overlapping of those curved X's. And it's creating a ribbed system where it looks like the ribs of a body or ribs of a skeletal structure. And they're going to, excuse me, they're going to come down and they're going to start to touch the tops of the arcades, which are those series of archways with the columns as the base moving all the way across the nave. And you can see that in the lateral perspective of figure 1236. And they're going to do two other things. Is they're going to start to slowly point the archways in the rib vaulting. You can see in figure 1236, right in the middle and the top, it's slightly cropped out in the center, very, very tip top. It slightly comes to a point. They're developing a very slight point, which is very beautiful visually, but it takes away from architectural strength and integrity. And by wanting to do that and give more volume and atmosphere inside of these cathedrals and inside of these religious spaces, they have to do something else. And that is what is left on figure 1236. And these figure 1236 are what are called exterior arches. And these exterior arches, the specific name is, hold on a second. The specific name is the Qualtric Arch, okay, and that arch again is going to be a precursor to what we're going to see in the Gothic period called flying buttresses. Flying buttresses. So write the word flying, like a bird flying, and then buttresses. B-U-T-T-R-E-S-S-E-S. Buttresses. And these are going to be those big winged buttresses on the outside that look like an exoskeleton of the cathedral that we see on Notre Dame, that we see at Chartres, and all of these very prominent French Gothic cathedrals that are very prominent and everybody knows what they are around the world. Notre Dame is the big one, right? All these big winged like exoskeletons, and it's because they have to have these exoskeletons called flying buttresses on the outside to help hold the pressure coming from these ribbed pointed arches on the inside of the nave, because a constant curve is strong and it distributes all the weight down to the base and it holds the structure. But whenever it goes at a point, it pushes the pressure out to the side, and there has to be something on the exterior to help hold the walls of that nave together, and that's called a flying buttress. And figure 1236 of the Durham Cathedral is going to be the beginnings of the use of these arches on the exterior, which are ultimately going to become flying buttresses. All right? So that's a big deal. So new inventions, but they're also using old Romanesque barrel vaulting techniques and groin vaulting techniques. So that's the Romanesque element of the Durham Cathedral. But they're kind of creating their own technique by slowly starting to point the arch, to point the barrel vault in the ribbing of the groin vaulting. They're starting to point it, which is going to create and have to make them start to add more extra stuff on the exterior. So it's Romanesque based off of the vaulting system, but it's very inventive and new in regards to the use of the pointing system in the groin barrel vaulted section, and then ultimately the use of the exterior arches to hold the body of the cathedral together. All right. Yeah, and if you see figure 1237, it's going to see you as 7-part vaults, and you can see the X's, and those X's are an indicator of that groin pointed vault system that's over the nave, and it also continues over the transept, and also the nave is broken up to like 2/3 and 1/3, and 1/3 of it is up towards the apse. So a whole new type of design is being brought in, based off again these the Normans who have taken over the English area, originally the Vikings. Okay, so we talked about the architecture. So let's talk about some of the painting. And we're going to look at figure 1238. And this is Hugo, Moses expounding the law, in figure 1238. And this is going to be following what we saw in the last chapter with the Hiberno-Saxon books and their production that we looked at in regards to St. Matthew. We looked at some of the paintings there. So they're going to be a derivative of that. And it's also going to be derivative of what we saw with the Holy Roman Empire just now with Hildegard with the Scavician writings. Okay, because if you look at Moses, you can see there's almost like these horns that are coming out above his head, but those are again visions, meaning that what he's expounding is coming from a higher place. It's coming from a divine source. So you can see the influence. Before we get into the Romanesque influence, you can see the influence coming from the Holy Roman Empire, which is ultimately coming from the Romanesque period, and then also the Hiberno-Saxon period. So again, when the Normans came and absorbed and annexed England and started to rule it as part of its own kingdom, they're taking some of the Anglo-Saxon techniques that we see dating all the way back to some of the biblical scriptural paintings that we saw during that time in chapter 11. So be able to go back and look at that as well, specifically the ones of St. Matthew. So they developed these types of Bibles with these big manuscripts, and they put them in the abbeys in England, and they made them very luxurious and very illuminating. And that's because, again, most of the folks at this time were illiterate, and they needed these visuals. And they're very icon registered-esque, meaning that they have that icon painting look to them, telling a story, but they're broken up into two sections. And if you think about it, going all the way back to late antiquity and Byzantine, which is derivative of the Roman Empire under Constantine, these were very important features to have an icon painting that gives a narrative because a lot of folks were illiterate, and then also the breaking down of the mosaics that we saw during that time with different registrations of narration. Like in this case, Moses is doing something up top and he's doing something different down low. All right, so it gives a story based off of these registers. That's Romanesque because we're pulling it from that time of late antiquity and that Byzantine, which is following right after the Roman period, the High Roman Empire. All right, still part of it though. Hugo was a secular artist relying on commissions from monasteries. So he wasn't a religious guy. He was just beginning to get paid well by rendering what the monasteries wanted. So commissions. And the reason I bring this up, it's going to become very important when we get into the Renaissance, because the Renaissance period is going to be less about how much money they're making. It's going to be more about notoriety and fame. And Hugo, Master Hugo, is the beginning of seeing that advent come into being. All right, and so he's more interested in, the name and the fame and getting paid, but not necessarily having a direct connection with the biblical parable material. All right, and let's see. Let me break it down and give you a little bit more Romanesque in regards to this. So it has a symmetrical leaf motif, all right, so patterns, which is very Romanesque. If you look around the border and the section in between the two narratives, those use of patterns, which is very Romanesque. They love patterns. They love to build up patterns and symbolic patterns at that. And that's very present here, bordering the narratives of what Moses is expounding. Again, I already talked about the horns and how it looks like these visions that are coming down into his eyes. Yeah, and then the lower panel is gentle and animated, and then the top panel is a little more abrasive. And that's very much Romanesque in that there is a very gentle twist and bend and element of calm collectiveness, but there's also a fierceness. And that's not something that we just saw in Rome, but we saw it in Greece, we saw it in Mesopotamia, and we saw it in Egypt. All right? So, really, what I'm saying is whenever we talk about elements that we saw in Rome, in the Roman Empire, that we term Romanesque, is actually derivative of Greek, like Greek-esque, which is derivative of Egyptian, Egyptian-esque, which is derivative of Mesopotamia, Mesopotamian-esque. So when we say Romanesque, we have to, again, keep funneling it back to its origins. And you can see when something's Romanesque, like the balance between abrasiveness and serenity, like the upper section, Moses expounding with his finger pointing forward, which is something that we would see with the Augustus sculptures in early Roman Empire art, is something that was also prevalent in the Greek gods during the late Greek art period, which came all the way back to the Egyptians holding one hand out in fierceness and one hand out in calm, that we saw in the canonical Egyptian sculptures, right, for the pharaohs before they went into the afterworld, and what those shrined sculptures look like, fierce and calm. And then also it was present in Mesopotamia, that archaic smile showing this sense of control and emotionlessness and contentness, but at the same time having to be fierce. So all of this is coming from the same source, and it's coming from the same source, which is the beginnings of civilization. So Romanesque is derivative of that, and these pieces, figure 1238 in particular in regards to the painting, is derivative of Romanesque. Okay, so that I just want to keep you on track in regards to where everything is originally coming from, and it is just this, and this is all Western art in particular, and that it's coming out of that ice age during that Paleolithic and Neolithic period into the civilization, and it's just kind of unwinding and developing, and then we're coming back to some of these original elements of antiquity, hence the importance of the Romanesque. Okay, so Rome does not live in a bubble; it comes from original sources as well, and that's all I'm trying to emphasize. Okay, I'll leave you at that. And one thing I forgot to mention in the lower panel, if you look at Moses, you'll see the curve in his body, right? That sine wave. Again, that's not truly Rome. It's Romanesque, but we're only calling it Romanesque because that's the closest we are. We're closer to Roman Empire than we are to the Greek Empire because it's closer in time. So we call it Romanesque. If it would have been the Greek Empire following Rome, then it would be Greek-esque or Grecian-esque. Because that sine wave in the body of Moses in the bottom is very derivative of the Greek contrapposta style. All right, that the veristic sculptors used in Rome, but it originated in Greece. All right, I'll leave you at that, and then we'll get moving into chapter 13, which is going to be the Gothic art period. Take care.